So it must be terms of, what we need to do, and I think that I'm good with that. No, I mean, you're asking about the you mean next Sunday?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a bit. I should be good.
Okay.
And then, yes, no, honestly, I'm good. What did I turn on? Spotlight. Oh, I was trying to turn the fans on.
I really got used to not having it.
Where's the fan?
Behind the poster or the way.
Oh. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but glad to hear it.
Thank you. I'm gonna stand up and shake your hand. Wasn't it? Oh.
That's much enough. Really, you like it?
Well, I like it. All right. Good morning, everyone. And I got you a show today. What? Okay. So we are gonna. We're still talking about the Gospels, the Jesus narratives, and what we started last week
We're just going to continue for as long as we go. And we're going to be kind of doing a synoptic, but we're just going to be looking at different parts of each of these narratives and somewhat comparing them, because they're different people, different intentions, different directions, all of those things. And I wanted to share this just in terms of perspective, because I haven't mentioned this before, and I personally find this really interesting. And it's just in terms of timing. And I put this up a couple of months ago, but it was during my sermon. Saul's conversion is believed to be around 36, give or take. And I want to emphasize that a lot of these dates are very give or take. So it's not like you wake up on a Tuesday and these things happened, but it's ish. Galatians, both Thessalonians, both Corinthians, and Romans are believed to be written 52, 55. Could be a little earlier, could be a little later, but those are pretty early dates for that. Now, for those of you who may do this, and I don't think anybody will, but if you do, and you're like, I'm curious about that, and you do, there are your conservative scholars, and they have these a little earlier. There are your later scholars, and so I tried to find a middle ground, and this seems to be somewhat of that. Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, both Timothy's and Titus were mid-60s, give or take. And so I share this because whenever we consider these narratives of Jesus, even Mark being around 70. Now that is a later scholarship date than what we've usually believed. But all of the Jesus narratives are at least 5 years. And with Galatians through Romans, you're talking 15, 20 years after Paul's letters. So just for context, these letters are being circulated around for 5, 10, 15 years. And then you have Mark coming on the scene, his narrative of Jesus' life. And so from the second group, Philemon and that group, to Matthew is, holy cow, that's 25 years in terms of time between when these things hit for the church and this narrative of Jesus' life. And between Galatians through Romans and Matthew, that's 35 years, 35 years. And then, of course, for Luke, it gets a little longer. John is a very, very late narrative for Jesus. And these can be fudged, a little earlier, a little later, but that's generally the time that it's understood that they are. So one of the reasons I bring this up is if you consider our culture 15 years ago, I don't know where you were 15 years ago or what was going on, but we did live in a different world. And people felt differently about different things. And humanity doesn't change. So it's not as if, Jesus came and lived and died and raised and then left. And now, let's just say 35 again for round numbers. 60 years later, you get the Gospel of John. And 50 years later, you get the Gospel of Luke. Well, it was mentioned last week, and I don't know how much we got into talking about it, but there is some really good scholarship out there, and I'm kind of inclined to believe this. I didn't necessarily want to share it because I didn't want to. I find this compelling that for that area, for Palestine, for Israel, I don't know, 80%, maybe 90%, very few people could read. Most of those people were illiterate. And so I want to emphasize, illiterate doesn't mean stupid. Illiterate doesn't mean retarded. Illiterate means you just can't read. And they didn't have a reason to read. So for them, as opposed to for us today, when a child learns how to read, they almost read and write in the same process. You know, you learn your letters and you write your letters. For them, it was a very, very different thing. You paid someone to teach you how to read. You paid someone to teach you how to write. And then you paid someone to do what? Teach you how to compose. How many of you guys would say if you had to write a letter for somebody, maybe for a grant, could do that? Most people just can't compose very well. Either they weren't trained or they're not good with organizing their thoughts and then putting them on a page in terms of paragraph ideas, etc. So most of these people, because there was no need for it, couldn't read. And if you can't read, you definitely can't compose. So then it begs the question, well, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Luke possibly could read because he was a doctor. Doesn't mean he did, but he could. Matthew was a tax collector, just a basic tax collector. So that definitely doesn't mean he could read. And the reason I bring all this up is because of what's that? Maybe. And so with John, what was John? If we understand this to be the same John. He's a fisherman. And fishermen had no reason to learn how to read. And if they couldn't read, they definitely couldn't compose. So who did these books? And it's very much thought that you have these Christian communities. And they, much like some of your Old Testament books, they would compile this information together. And then they would put somebody's name on it that had some authority. And Mark's authority is his connection to Peter. Matthew is as an apostle. Luke is as a companion. And John, of course, is who he is. But if it is the case that John is still alive in the later 90s, John's an old man. So he would obviously have to, orally share this with people, and then they compose it and put it together. Yeah.
He talks about the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right. Well, there are many things that we find that are both in the New and in the Old Testament. For instance, it's understood that Genesis took about a century to compile and write. So it's very possible that Matthew is writing this after the fact. This happened, Jesus talked about it, said it was going to happen, it did happen, and he writes it later. So if it is the case that that is a good dating, and just to confirm with you guys, I am sharing with you what scholarship says about these things. And some may say, well, I'd rather take conservative than liberal, and liberal's kind of a fuzzy term because a lot of people don't like the idea of something that's liberal. But these are the guys that don't seem to have a dog in the race. These are the dates that they have. And so Matthew writes about something that Jesus did talk about. It did happen. And then he writes it after Jerusalem falls. The other thing I find interesting about this is Jerusalem, if that is the case, Jerusalem falls, the temple's gone, sacrifices, all of Judaism is gone. And even if Matthew wrote it a little bit after that, and now they're writing their Jesus narratives as a result, after Jerusalem's been razed, it's gone. Everything is laid flat. And then they write these narratives about Jesus, as opposed to doing it in the 50s or 60s. Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, the temple and all the things that they normally physically do. Now, one of the nice things about this is you could look at these things and go, I just don't buy that. And what's the result of that? You don't buy it. You've got, again, more conservative scholarship, and they place these dates anywhere from 5 to 10 years earlier. One of the guys I listened to essentially said, we just don't know. And so the only reason I find this compelling is mostly Galatians through Titus, the dates that those are written. And so Paul's letters to the churches are out first. And then you get anywhere from 25, 30, 35 years later, you get these narratives about Jesus' life. I just find that very, very interesting. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, so we're going to look through Matthew and Luke in terms of the what they highlight about the birth of Jesus. And we looked at this a little bit last week, but I wanted to share some more thoughts about this in terms of what they highlight, what they focus on. And I hope this is compelling to you because I've just never thought to do this before. And as you look at Matthew and Luke and what they highlight, what they emphasize, it's very, very interesting in terms of their audience and what they're wanting to focus on and highlight. So Matthew begins by highlighting Joseph. After the genealogy, he hits Joseph. Now, as Matthew being a Jew and writing to Jews, do you find it interesting that he first, out of the gate, after the descendancy, he hits Joseph as opposed to Mary, which Luke does? I find that interesting. But, it is a patriarchal society, even though Joseph isn't actually his father. So this angel visits Joseph. And as opposed to Luke, we don't know the name of the angel. We just know it as a messenger visiting Joseph, having this conversation. One other thing before we dive into these things is Matthew, Mark, and Luke specifically, not that John doesn't, but in terms of the synoptic gospels, each one of them have an intention for their narrative. They are wanting to put ideas one after the other for the intention of telling a story. This is their narrative about Jesus to a specific audience to prove that he is the Messiah of God. And why would that be important for Matthew's audience? Because as we understand it, he's writing mostly to the Jews. Why would his narrative be important to notice for his audience? Yeah. Yes. Yes, ideas he puts pop up, and they're going to key in on those things. And so that's what he does. You're not going to find the same thing in Luke, and you're definitely not going to find it in Mark. So Matthew's going to highlight these ideas that for them go toward Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, of the Jews. And again, Mark and Luke have different narrative emphases. So this messenger of God visits Joseph. Joseph's name means he will add. Found that interesting. And Joseph complies with the angel's request. So going to Matthew chapter 1. And another little addition here that I don't think will have any... I didn't do it on this. Man. Oh, well, never mind. We'll do that next time. So Matthew chapter 1. So this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah. Now, NIV says Messiah. The NLT, I believe, says Christ. And the reason why I pulled in last week this Hebrew, and it kind of piqued my interest, is the Jews at the time, if the things that I went to were accurate, spoke Aramaic. That was generally they could speak Greek and understand it, but Hebrew only in terms of the Torah. But they spoke Aramaic just in normal, in business maybe some Greek, and only the Torah in terms of Hebrew. So why would Matthew here use this term Messiah as opposed to Christ? Because Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. I find that interesting. So this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Before Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. After he considered this, a messenger of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. So this is one of those things where maybe for you it's getting in the weeds and may not be of great interest. But here he is called Jesus, which is Greek. Joshua is Hebrew. And yet above, he's called Jesus the Messiah, which is Hebrew. Why not go Jesus the Christ? And I haven't looked at the Greek for that yet. Because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the messenger of the Lord had commanded him, and he took Mary home as his wife, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. So one of the important things here is that Joseph complies. He has a decision that he's going to make, has this dream with this messenger, and then complies. He obeys what this messenger tells him to do. And then we have a fulfillment of prophecy. And this is especially prominent in Matthew. This isn't something that Mark does at all. Luke does it a little bit, but Matthew, a lot of fulfilled prophecies, because that's important to his audience. In chapter 2, you find the wise men's journey after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star as it arose and have come to worship him," or to draw near to him. By the way, the word worship here is, it's the idea, it's the same word we find in Matthew 14 after they get in the boat and then they worship Jesus. It's the idea of drawing near. It's something that we don't talk about or think about a lot. It's really not necessarily what we do on Sunday. It's a mental thing. It is a heart thing. We should do it, but it's to draw near. It's to be in awe of something. And so when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. So let's talk about that for a second. Why would King Herod in Jerusalem be disturbed that they are hearing that the King of the Jews has been born in Bethlehem? Why would that bother these two groups? He's the King of the Jews, right? Right? So why would that bother the people of Jerusalem? Why would they be upset that the King of the Jews was born? So whenever we understand some of the cultural elements that are taking place during this time and some of the stuff that happened before, which we may get into, that is not something that they want. So it was troubling both to Herod and to Jerusalem. And I don't know if you've ever put those two together, thought about that, but Jerusalem is disturbed, is troubled whenever they first hear about Jesus' birth. It's bothersome. Bothersome's not a good word. They're troubled by it. And so whenever he had called together all his people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where this Messiah, where this Christ was to be born. And so in Bethlehem of Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. So out of the chute, chapter 2, or verse, 25. So verse 34, if you will, because if you don't have chapters, you only have verse divisions. Really early, we get into another prophecy. This was to fulfill what the prophet wrote. You, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And so twice Matthew is going to take a prophecy, a verse out of the Torah, and pull it and make it a part of this situation. And not only pull it, make it a part, but what even more so is he doing? What was written there is talking about this. This is what's happening now to fulfill this prophecy. So then Herod called the Magi secretly, found out from them where the exact time the star had happened. And so he sent them to Bethlehem. Go search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. And after they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star that they had seen rose and went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures, brought him the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after they had been warned and dreamed not to go back, they didn't go back. And so now we find the story, verse 13, of their escape out of Egypt. When they had gone, a messenger of the Lord appeared to Joseph. Get up, take the child. So up to this point, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this or ever cared to, and when I say that, I'm by no means saying anything derogatory, but up to this point, everything is focused on Joseph. The only thing that we have about Mary is that he was betrothed to her, and he was going to put her away, but he decided not to because a messenger came and told him not to, that she would be pregnant with the Holy Spirit. And even in chapter 2, the messenger comes back to Joseph, and they need to get to Egypt because of something terrible about to happen in that area. And then he comes back to him and said, after Herod dies, verse 19, the messenger of the Lord came back to him in a dream, said, now you can go back and you're going to live in Nazareth. And that's to fulfill that he will be called a Nazarene. So what I find interesting about this is as important and needed as the virgin story is to fulfill prophecy, that he is born of the Holy Spirit, Matthew, written to the Jews, and that is an important story. What does not happen in Matthew? There's no virgin birth. I mean, it's alluded to, but it's not talked about like Luke is going to talk about it. All of this is in terms of Joseph, don't let her go. A messenger tells him, take off to Egypt. Messenger tells him, come back and live in Nazareth. This is Matthew's out of the gate. This is what he goes toward. And a lot of, at least 4 prophecies before we get to chapter 3 about Jesus and these prophecies that he is going to fulfill. Any thoughts? I know this is a little different than just opening up Matthew and going through it and hitting it, but I think comparing is interesting. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Really not Jews. So then wise men come, where is he called King of Jews?
Right.
That hasn't set Herod off.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
did, obviously, back.
Right. Right. Right.
I think what Matthew's trying to show, perhaps, is that Herod was not in fact a Jew. Reminding people.
Right.
He's not the king of Jews.
Right.
He was king of time.
Right.
Appointed.
Appointed. Yeah. 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 And also, make sure I'm accurate on this. Okay, so in Matthew, and until I noticed this, I was like, holy cow, how did I miss this? So in Matthew, when you get the birth of Jesus, in verse 7 and 8, Matthew 2, what do we find these wise men finding? In Matthew 2, verse 7 and 8. Do they find the baby? He's a child. So these wise men, these magi, what they find is a child in a house. He's not in the manger. He's in a house. Wherever that is. And the word child there is child. It's not a baby. So Matthew highlights Joseph and both the issue with Herod leaving to Egypt, and when these magi find him, however long that took, he is now a child. He's not a baby. They saw the child with his mother. They bowed down and worshiped him, gave him the gifts, and then they were sent off to Egypt. So again, curious things here for Matthew to highlight. I don't know how many of you have thought before. You know, Matthew, of course, is going to highlight the birth of Jesus, and it doesn't. Luke does that for whatever reason, because he's generally a Gentile audience written for that. Now, I also want to highlight, I keep talking about specific audiences. These narratives were circulated. So it's not like Matthew only went to a Jewish audience and Luke only went to a Gentile audience. These things were circulated, but these narratives were intended for specific audiences to highlight different things. And so, yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. 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 Right. So
And the only reason they were in this table is everyone came to get the census. So once they left.
right. But the curiosity is where between Jesus being born and them leaving for Egypt, where do you have Jesus and Joseph and Mary? Where are they? somewhere in Bethlehem, in a house. And these are people who, from a secular standpoint, well, to say they weren't wealthy, they weren't that at all. Most of those people lived, what do they call it, hand-to-mouth subsistence. So how did they get the house? How did they get what? Maybe. Yeah, right.
Expensive gifts.
Right. Right. Yeah, maybe so. But they were already in the house, it seems, whenever the Magi get there. So just some curious questions. I had personally never thought through all this until someone walked me through it, and I was like, I've never filled in those gaps in my mind before. There was two. Yeah. So this is, again, when we look at Matthew, highlights Jesus at 2-ish years in a house as a child, and the wise men, Magi, come to visit him. They go to Egypt, which fulfills Hosea 11:1. And so in these 4 places, before we get to Matthew chapter 3, the emphasis on Joseph's compliance as well as the fulfillment of prophecy. Joseph gets the messenger, and both in terms of staying with Mary, about going to Bethlehem, about going to Egypt, and then coming back from Egypt. And in all of those, he complies. He does what he's told to do. So that's Matthew's emphasis. And I'm not saying those are things to be debated or argued about. It's just his emphasis on Joseph and his actions and what he does within the larger story. And after this, starting in Matthew chapter 3, almost completely, who is gone? Joseph. I mean, we don't hear a whisper about this guy. We don't even hear in terms of, Jesus' father or Joseph. We don't hear anything. He is just gone in both of the narratives that talk about him. He's gone. Yeah, we're getting there because he doesn't discuss anything. Yeah, and I mentioned that last week. Mark and John, how do they treat the birth of Jesus? A nothing. I mean, Mark begins with John, and of course, John begins with, let's see, multiple narratives, Jesus narratives done before this. Okay, that's not really, okay, so we'll get into that next week. So yeah, Mark doesn't touch it at all. I mean, nothing. He doesn't even say, yeah, Jesus was born and then they went to Egypt. Now let's get into John. He bolts right into John the Baptist. John starts with Jesus as God, the Word, and Creator. And then he gets into John as well. Doesn't even touch the birth. So the reason I have always found all this interesting is, with the Christmas theme and all the times that I've heard about these things, and I just assumed Matthew and Luke did the same thing because I didn't do a whole lot of, really get into the weeds and look at this stuff. And when you look at what these guys emphasize, it's just interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 So, if we quickly go back, notice if it's the case that Matthew was written, and let's just say between 75 and 85. So Matthew is speaking, no doubt, to probably a very different culture, a very different group of people, because it's been, if we say 80, it's been 50 years since the resurrection. 50 years. Think about your life 50 years ago. Think about our culture 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you could, maybe you wouldn't, but you could walk into a room and say, man, I'm feeling really gay today. And everybody'd say, that's good. Now, use the same word, and you get what? Entirely different reaction. So it's been 50 years since the resurrection that Matthew puts this out. And so Matthew's push for fulfillment about Joseph, for the Magi, all of these things he highlights, as opposed to doing it in the mid-40s. So just interesting stuff.
Because these guys are constantly doing the work of the church.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much,
Right.
what they did socially, it's, what were they doing every day, working every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was probably more current in their minds, but still.
Yeah. Yeah. And a real quick comment, because that's another curious thing, is, wherever this letter goes, the church has been there for anywhere from 10 to 30 years. Because Paul writing to the Galatians in, 55, let's say, and to the church at Thessalonica, to Corinth, to Rome. And by the way, Rome and Galatians an area, not a city. So it went to this big area where the church is, and the church is going through its stuff. And then they get, and I hope I'm communicating this in the way it's in my head, 30, 40 years of church work, of sharing the gospel, and then they get this Jesus narrative. This is talking about the life of Christ, both to Jews, Matthew, and to Luke, to Gentiles. At least for me, that puts a different context on it in terms of when these things came out and what their highlights and emphases were. Yeah. Right, we don't. Yeah.
It works both ways. If it wasn't happening, it's likely that Matthew would say, stop worrying about something. Whoever was
Yeah.
king of the Jews.
Right.
They weren't the king of the Jews.
Right.
He was the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
So it works on both sides.
Yeah. 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 I did listen to one guy that had a different view of the dates. He was like, look, at the end of the day, we just don't know. So that was his view and his process, which I found interesting also. So
We know it's expired.
yeah, exactly. All right. Well, next week we will get into Luke and then get into Mark a little bit, and we'll just go from there. If if this is stuff that you guys are connecting to and find interesting, we'll continue. If not, just let me know and we'll hit something else, because I want you guys to learn and grow and all that kind of stuff. So let me know what you're thinking.